Right, hello everybody. Knowledge management, not a typical subject for a technical conference, but this is knowledge management for the technically inclined, and that's definitely you. Otherwise, you're probably at the wrong conference, I think. Now, I'm Jacqui Reed. I'm the author of Communication Patterns, and I'm also the principal architect at Read the Architecture. And we enable businesses to own their architecture through things like software architecture, enterprise architecture, and knowledge management, among others. You can find me at all these different places if you would like to. Now, knowledge management is vital to success, and this is a really important thing to consider in your organizations. But what actually is knowledge management? It isn't just documentation, which is what people tend to think of when they hear the phrase knowledge management. And it isn't just buy Confluence and you're done. Sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry when it comes to Confluence. So one does not simply buy knowledge management. Now, these apps can help you with your knowledge management, but they're a very small part of it when it comes down to it all. Now, I want to have a look at what people think knowledge management is, because I've told you a bit about what knowledge management isn't. And this is the kind of thing you will find when you look for knowledge management online. There seem to be hundreds of models, and there are lots and lots and lots of companies that are trying to sell you their software which fits a particular model. There's all these different buzzwords, and this is what puts people off knowledge management. It's so complicated, but it doesn't really need to be this complicated. Now, before we go into some examples of knowledge management, I want you to think about a couple of tasks that you probably do quite often. Is naming your code repository knowledge management? Yes, it is. We need to name our repositories so that people can discover them and so that people know what's in it without having to open it and dig through it. And of course, naming is one of the two hard things in software development. There's naming things, cache invalidation, and off-by-one errors. Sorry, that's my favorite joke. I have to use it all the time. What about integrating your application with another one? Is that knowledge management? You're getting the pattern here. It is, because when we're looking at the edges of things, this is where people discover knowledge, and also where knowledge interacts where it's with other applications. Now, today I want to kind of stretch your idea of what knowledge management is, because knowledge management affects how you build software, but also how you run it as well. And I can't stretch quite as much as Alfie there. But looking at his face, you'd think he's not very happy, but he has what I call resting grump face. So he's quite happy. Now, I promised some examples of knowledge management. Now, I'm going to give you quite a long list, but this is non-exhaustive. First of all, there's inventories. Now, these are like a sort of catalogue of all the knowledge that you have. Dashboards, they can be dynamic, they can be static. You've got documents and files that you have in lots of places all over your organization. That's one of the things you would add to an inventory. Then you've got expertise locators. This is where people know things, and if you want to find that knowledge, you need to know who has that expertise. Policies and procedures that you use in your organization. Wikis, articles, knowledge bases, blogs, they're all part of this. Forms and templates that you use. Then databases, you're going to have a huge range of those. Even if you don't necessarily see them, they'll be behind software that you use. And then there's also meetings and workshops. And these are really good for generating knowledge. It's not necessarily recorded, though, which is something to think about. Now, knowledge management is the process of capturing, distributing, and effectively using knowledge. Tom Davenport gave us this in 1994, and a more concise definition hasn't really come about since then. This, I said, was too complicated. So let's use Tom Davenport's. We can capture, distribute, and effectively use. Much more simple. But I want to tweak this slightly because I think distribute's now the wrong word to use, because we don't necessarily know who's going to be using our knowledge when we create it and write it down. And how do we solve that when we're using a distributed system? One of those methods is pub/sub. So I'm going to change that to publish so that we can think about this and get a better mental model for what knowledge management is. So 30 years later, hard to think it's that long, I'm going to change this with a hat tip to Tom Davenport to knowledge management is the process of capturing, publishing, and effectively using knowledge. And that's our basis for today. Now, I said knowledge management shouldn't be complicated, but it is complex. Subtle difference. So think about exchanging knowledge within your organization between people, teams, and departments. But your organization is not in a vacuum. It's going to have distributors, it's going to have customers, it's going to have partnerships. You might be outsourcing things. And this is inter-organizational knowledge. There is knowledge in other organizations that you probably need to know. And that's even more important because these relationships can change quite quickly. And if that happens, like say, think about the damage that's caused when you change an outsourcing company. Not only do you have all these like new relationships that you need to build, but if you haven't got that knowledge recorded, you're scrambling to get that outgoing team to record that knowledge, and you're competing with all the people who want them to finish all the technical things and writing the code, things like that. So this is one of the reasons why actually writing things down is really important. So in reality, knowledge management is ignored, forgotten, and low priority. And because of that, we don't get the capture. And if we don't have the capture, we haven't got anything to publish. And then we can't effectively use it. Now, IDC says that Fortune 500 companies lose around $31.5 billion a year by failing to share knowledge. That's just the Fortune 500. What about all the other businesses in the world? So if we want to stop losing that money, let's look at a few knowledge management things kind of in the wild. Now, what do you think happened to teams that, as we went into COVID, that didn't have good knowledge management? It was a lot harder for them than other teams. And now, most businesses probably have a mixture of people who work in an office, or a hybrid, or are completely remote. In fact, some businesses are just completely remote. And so we need to optimize for this remote working. And one way to do that is called remote first. Now, this is different from the so-called remote friendly, which is it sees remote work as a bolt-on and a perk to office work. And so with remote first, we optimize for remote. Everybody is treated like they work remotely. And one example of that is that when you have a meeting, if one person's joining remotely, everyone joins remotely. And it puts everyone on this level playing field. As well as that, we value output over time worked. And this is really good because it discourages the unhealthy attitude of working late just so your manager sees that you're sitting there working. You might not be doing anything useful, but you're just trying to get that promotion. So in this way, everyone has that level playing field for promotion, things like that. There's also an emphasis on communication. And this is on asynchronous communication. And when we communicate asynchronously and have this emphasis, it means that everyone can contribute wherever they are, whenever they are, and whatever days they work. And when we do this, we get business continuity. And this comes from a variety of things, but if you have people in different time zones, that means work can carry on throughout the day, even as some people are going to bed. It also means if you get things like storms or public transport strikes, like we had here on Wednesday, it means people can still get to the office because the office is at their home. Very easy. You also get improved productivity, and this is because everyone's enabled to do their best work wherever they are. And people are happier because they are recognised for their output and not just for having their bum in the seat all day. Anyone can do that. And then you also get improved documentation. And one of the main reasons for this is because asynchronous communication actually creates documentation just because of its very nature. Now, I've talked about asynchronous communication versus synchronous communication. And before we go on, I want to make sure that I've defined those because it's important to understand the difference. So asynchronous communication relies on all parties being available at the same time and responding in real time. That's synchronous. Asynchronous communication does not assume or expect the recipient to pick up or respond to a message as soon as it's received. So, thinking about that, is this talk synchronous or asynchronous? Yes, it's synchronous for all of you who are here watching it live. Go on, give me a wave, synchronous audience. Show me you're alive. Yes. But it's asynchronous for anyone who's watching the recording. So I'm going to give a wave to all the people watching the recording afterwards, the asynchronous audience. So depending on the point in the life cycle, communication can change whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. Now, I want to give you a few more knowledge management techniques that you can use on a daily basis. The first of these is glossaries. Now, these are a sort of contextual dictionary. They are definitions of the different terms that you use. Now, you've probably used these, but I want to give you some best practice. So the first of these is centralize for discoverability. If you've centralized, everyone knows where to look. You don't have to think, which glossary do I need to look for this definition in? You also don't need to think, which glossary do I put this new definition in? It saves a lot of time. But you also want to federate it for maintenance. You don't want a gatekeeper or a bottleneck. So centralize for discoverability, but federate for maintenance. You also want to partition it by domain. Now, you can do this even if you aren't using domain-driven design, although I do like it. But you will find that a term in your organization probably has more than one meaning depending on the context. And so when you create your glossary, you need to define what scope, domain, or context that definition applies to. You might have one term used in your finance department, which is completely different from a term used in your software. Then you want to cross-reference for simplicity. So you're going to have terms in your definitions that need to be defined or are already defined. And you don't want to duplicate that effort. So you need to cross-reference your terms. You also want to link into your glossary from elsewhere and link out of your glossary where appropriate as well. Make it easy for people to find stuff. So that's glossaries. Now, this is what I call products over projects. And creating a product mindset can really enable you to find things. So say you have a project, and if you're really unlucky, it's probably called Project Phoenix. How many people have ever worked on a Project Phoenix? Oh, the rest of you are really lucky. So if you've only got one project, you kind of know where everything is, and everyone knows where the requirements are and what's going on. Well, hopefully you do. But even if that project finishes, other projects are going to start. You'll probably have projects running in tandem. And at this point, you don't get a link between all these projects. I've seen places where each project has a different SharePoint site, and the people working on one project don't necessarily have access to all the other SharePoint sites, let alone know they exist. And you get these kind of silos. Everyone knows silos. There's so many of them in businesses. Or maybe they're kind of more like coops here because of all the birds. But this is what we get when we organize things by projects. If we change to this product mindset and organize around a product, we can create implicit and explicit links between all these projects. Everyone knows they all exist. And because of this, you get a more holistic view. You get reuse of information. You don't get the duplication and the information loss from older projects. People can access that information. Now, there's also inventories, which I mentioned earlier. Now, when you're creating an inventory, you're going to find that you have two different types of knowledge. You've got explicit knowledge. Now, this is the kind of thing that's quite often already written down. And this is the stuff that's easy to articulate. And then we have the implicit knowledge. And those are the things that are more difficult to explain to people. Think of the stuff when you've onboarded somebody or handed over, the things that were difficult to explain or that you've probably forgot to tell them. So those are the implicit things. Now, when we look at explicit knowledge, we want to think, what is that knowledge? We also want to think about where that knowledge is and who has created that knowledge, who needs to access it, who's responsible for maintaining it. You also want to think about the structure. Now, that's whether it's a knowledge base, a document, a diagram, things like that. You also want to think about the purpose. What is that information actually for? Because documenting that helps people understand what it is. With implicit knowledge, it's more about the who, because implicit knowledge is in people's heads. So you want to know who has this knowledge. You want to know where the people are who have the knowledge. You want to know what the knowledge is. And then you do need to consider the structure, because implicit knowledge is a spectrum. There's also what we call tacit knowledge. And that's the knowledge that's really difficult or impossible to articulate. If you think about things like riding a bike or leadership, those are more tacit. And so those things are probably going to stay in people's heads. And you're going to be putting those into a database so that people can find them. But there's going to be some implicit knowledge that you think, wait a minute, we should write that down. That should be explicit. And so the side effect of creating your inventory is that you should actually end up with more artifacts of knowledge. Now, in software, we automate things like testing, deployment, infrastructure, and we can also automate our knowledge management. Automating things is good. Now, you may have heard of documentation as code. The overall process here is that, first of all, we write down that knowledge. We then convert it into different formats and that we want. And we then publish that. Now, if you look at this, yes, this is the first two parts. This is our writing stuff down. This is our publishing it. And then we're hoping that people are going to use it well. Now, I'll give you a quick example of this. So often you will use a repository of some sort, like Git, and you put all the different types of files in here. Now, these files can be things like markdown, text. You can put things like plant UML, mermaid in here. It's whatever suits the context. You then have an optional manual review by trusted reviewers. And you would normally want to do this if this documentation is going to be published and be public, like say it's for your customers. It's less important if it's internal. You also have an automatic review, and this is a bit like unit tests, so you're looking at things like syntax and readability. And once you've done that, then you can have an automatic process that will build this, and it will then publish to the different formats. But this isn't just about creating a PDF and a web page of the same information. This is about creating different formats with different content as well. You can create a PDF that's for C-suite, or a PDF that has completely different content for your partners, your partner companies. You can have an internal wiki and an external wiki which have more or less the same information, but maybe some of it is only internal. And it means that when you update that small piece of information in a markdown file, if that's used in many places, it's then just built into those places and all kept up to date. And this is separating our data from presentation, which is what we do most of the time in software. And this optimizes our knowledge management. But I talked about docs as code. That actually comes under the umbrella of knowledge management as code. And there are other ways that we can automate our knowledge. So one of the things we really need to think about is keeping documentation up to date. Now, if you have something that changes all the time, if you are pushing things to production every minute, even every day, you cannot keep it up to date manually. You need to be automatically building documentation. So if you've got an API, one option is to use OpenAPI. And it will automatically create a page like this, where people can explore the endpoints. And your end user really needs this. They can even actually use the endpoint and see what comes back. And they can explore the models that are used. Now imagine trying to keep that up to date manually. It wouldn't be possible, but your end customers, whether they're internal or external, really need this information. Another example is contract testing. And I'm going to show you some consumer-driven contract testing. With this, you have a consumer service, and they apply their integrations against a mock. And then this generates a contract. That is then stored in a contract broker and is shared with any producer services. Those producer services then test their integrations against that contract and a mock. And it means that you are testing these all by themselves. This is really important because when it comes to integration testing, it's incredibly expensive to stand up an environment, deploy everything, try to cover that all with tests, and then try and work out what's gone wrong somewhere in one of those services that in the whole deployment. Now with these contract brokers, you can normally also view that contract. And I'll show you an example. This one's from Pact, which is open source. And this is knowledge management. This is a dashboard, and it's showing you all the statuses of these different contracts. And everybody can then access that and see the health and what's happening. All the different teams can access this, and they don't have to talk to each other so much, only when things aren't working well. Now, what we're moving towards here is what I call a hive mind. Now, this isn't like the hive mind in Star Trek where everybody is controlled, so don't worry about that. But this is where we are sharing the right knowledge with each other. We're optimizing that knowledge so that it's easy to find. And we can think about this hive mind in terms of cognitive load. Now, cognitive load is the amount of information that your brain or working memory can process. And when we don't have knowledge management, we have chaos and we have high cognitive load because we have to try and remember things. When we start to implement knowledge management, we're bringing that cognitive load down. It's easier to find things. We don't have to remember as much. And then when we're getting towards this hive mind state, we're getting towards this optimal kind of phase of being able to find what you want, when you want, easily. And this becomes a continuum. And when we're in this hive mind end, it's not about having more knowledge, because if you just put more knowledge in there, you've got more to maintain and more to search through. This is about optimizing that knowledge so that it has what people need when they need it, and it's easy to find. Now we can also look at the wisdom hierarchy. And if you see where knowledge is in this hierarchy, it's on top of information, which is on top of data. This is actually data engineering. Knowledge management is data engineering. And many people think, oh, I'm a software engineer. That's a soft skill, but it's not. You're an engineer. You should be engineering this data. And what we're trying to get to is this wisdom, and that wisdom is your hive mind. That's using the knowledge that you have built up. Now, some of you are probably thinking, it's okay, we've got AI now. That's going to come to my rescue and everything's going to be fine. But unfortunately, that's not quite the case. You're still going to have to do that legwork, because if what you've got is a complete mess, we're going to have this kind of situation. So if you haven't got something good to put in, you're not going to get something good coming out at the end of it. So you can't rely on AI, sorry. Now, one good way to get towards this hive mind is to use collaborative knowledge management, because what we want to do is get a real 360-degree view of all the information, because you're going to find that one person knows different things from another. And one of the ways you can do that is through big picture event storming. Now, this is where you get the people with the knowledge, which includes business and technical, and you're going to break down those silos, find out what's going on, but also find the points where people disagree over either what happens now or what should happen. You're going to be pinpointing the pain points and problems. Say that 10 times quickly. And this is a really useful method for doing that. Another one is domain storytelling. Now, this is similar, but you end up with diagrams like this with icons. And this brings the focus in on just one story. There's not even an if in there. If there's another route that people could go, you create another story. And so this brings the focus in really well on one story at a time. Both very useful. There's also bite-sized architecture sessions. And in my opinion, these are really good, not just for architecture and code, but for business as well, or a mix. And there's two things I want to point out here. The first is number 2 up there, which is called Alone Together. And that's where people have time to write down what they think something does, or whatever you're looking at, without the loud voices taking over. And that means you get more information, more points of view, and you also get people engaging more because they feel heard and understood. The other one here is this repetitive nature, and this means that you can get this incremental change in your organization. So 2 very important points on that one. Now, this one's from Jeff Bezos, and what they do is they have what they call a 6-page memo. And this is a narrative memo which is created before a meeting. And then the first 30 minutes of the meeting are spent literally for everybody silently reading this document, making notes, mulling it over. And then the rest is discussion. And there's some good points and bad points about this. The good one is that it protects your time. You don't need to use your evenings to read these things. It also means you're not waiting for someone to catch up in the meeting, and you're all literally on the same page when you're talking about things. The bad points are that you only have that half an hour. What if you need to do some research on something? You probably then need to have another meeting. And you also want to make sure that that document is as collaborative as the meeting is. That document should never just be made by one person. There should be at least a review of that document before the meeting. Now, you may have heard of architecture decision records. They're not just for architects. These are for developers. They're also for people like product owners and project managers who want to have a say on these. And these are normally done in plain text, quite often things like Markdown or ASCII doc. And they contain what decision was made, but also the why. Why do we need the why? You're going to avoid some big problems if you record why a decision was made. The first of these is changing important decisions. If you don't know why a decision was made, you don't know if it's safe to change it. Don't waste time and money on that. There's also what Birgitta Böckler of ThoughtWorks calls whack-a-mole decisions. And these are the decisions and questions that just keep popping up and have to be whacked back down. And if you have an ADR, then the question can be answered in a couple of minutes rather than a couple of days' research. You also have onboarding. You don't want to explain why you've done something over and over again every time someone joins your team. You probably don't remember either. So make ADRs part of your onboarding process. And then, of course, there's the classic staff turnover. If someone leaves and it's in their head, you've lost it. Maybe you can find them on LinkedIn and beg them to tell you the answer, but probably not. And then people forget things. If someone's been working at a company for 20 years, they're not going to remember why a decision was made 10 years ago. They probably don't remember why it was made last week. So we're avoiding all these problems. We can take this a step further and go with business decision records, a higher umbrella term. We can make procurement decision records so that when your contract for something that you've bought is coming up for renewal, it's really easy for you to work out if the situation has changed and you might want to move to something else. Or maybe you do want to sign again. We've got security decision records. If your security team is recommending a particular authorization service, if you record why, then all the teams in your organization will know whether that is appropriate for them or whether they need to talk to the security team to discuss using something else. It's also good for review when that comes up. There's also hiring. Don't rely on a hiring manager having written notes or keeping them. This can be very useful if someone's in a probation period. And then there's also business strategy. It's really, people will get behind your initiatives if they understand why. But it also makes it really easy to review them when that review period comes up or when change happens, because change happens every day. And it makes it much easier for management and C-suite to decide whether things need to change in their decisions. So, I've got a few key takeaways today because I have covered an awful lot. First of all, if you've got a software big ball of mud, you're probably going to end up with a documentation big ball of mud as well, and vice versa. They feed into each other. Whichever one comes first, this is chicken and egg. If one gets worse, the other's probably going to get worse as well. This also applies if you end up with a distributed big ball of mud, or what I like to call a wall of ivy. And I call it that because you can't kind of see all the implicit connections between your services. They're kind of hidden by these leaves. And if you try and kind of peel this back, you're probably going to make a bit of a mess on your wall. So the point I'm making here is that good knowledge management is vital to building and understanding any software, especially if you're going to try and migrate from legacy software to new software. If you don't understand legacy, you can't build your new software. We need to collaborate to collect that knowledge to get that 360-degree view. And so we need to involve as many minds as possible. Even the newest person on your team, or most junior, is going to have some insight that they've picked up and other people either don't think of or just have never noticed. You need to elicit the implicit knowledge, otherwise you will miss it. You didn't think this was going to turn into a rap, did you? But that will help you remember it, won't it? So you need to get this knowledge out of people's heads, because we all know that the time we want that knowledge is when it's either been forgotten or that person's left the company. So knowledge management supports better decision making. We don't need a management information system. We need a decision support system, because we make decisions every day. And if we don't have this knowledge to base those decisions on, we're kind of stabbing in the dark. We're not basing it on anything before. So I said that it was data engineering. You need to engineer your knowledge as much as you engineer your software. This is part of your jobs because you are working in software, whether you're technical or business. And you need to own your knowledge, and you do that through knowledge management. Now, as with everything, your mileage may vary. This is going to depend on where you're starting from. Maybe you're the camper van, maybe you're the moped. And trying these different techniques is the first step towards this. There isn't a miracle cure or silver bullet. But if we work together on it and we consider this data engineering, you're going to be moving in the right direction to get to that hive mind. So we can come back to the capture, publish, and effectively use any time that you're thinking, I don't know what to do here. Come back to this simplicity. Now, this wisdom at the top, this is your secret sauce. This is your decision-making based on your knowledge, your decisions about your software, about your architecture. And if you want to own your architecture, you need to own your knowledge. And if you don't own both of these, you're not in control. Your knowledge management and communication are the bedrocks to your organizational success. And if you don't have those, then you're building your organization and your software on sand. So I will be publishing the slides on the website and also on my social media channels, if you want to find those, along with some further reading as well, if you're interested. And I would really love it if you could tell me your thoughts on this. Tell me your experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So either come and find me this morning or find me via my website or on social media. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqui. Thank you.